What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Corey Hughes' Bloody History. So today I want to get this out of the way. We're going to wrap up the 8 plus 2 equals 10 series that I've been doing, covering the Secret Service car and their duplicity. So what we want to do today is we're going to go over the statements of John Reedy and the statements of Paul Landis, and some of Weisberg's commentary on Landis' statements. And I'm going to go over the slides and show in graphic detail that when the Secret Service car pulled into Dealey Plaza, there were 10 men on it. 2 of them got off, Dave Powers and Clint Hill. Thus, there should only be 8 men on the car for the trip to Parkland Hospital. But that is not the case. By the time the vehicle turns off to the Stemmons Freeway, they've picked up 2 passengers because there are 10 men on the car. And we're going to go over the details of that and then what happened after. But let's start off with the statement of John Reedy. If you're listening to this on the audio podcast, this is the one episode that I highly advise you go over to Rockfin and watch there. You can watch it without a subscription. I'll make this one free, not premium, so everybody can view it. But I do highly recommend everyone go and watch this one because I'm going to be covering in detail the photographic evidence. But let's start off here with this statement from John D. Jack Reedy. I, John D. Reedy, Special Agent, United States Secret Service, Washington, D.C., arrived at Love Field, Dallas, Texas, approximately 11:40 a.m., Friday, November 22nd, 1963, on board the presidential aircraft, Air Force One. Upon arrival, I left the aircraft and went to the press area, photographers and newsmen, located near the presidential ramp at the rear of the plane. Here, President John F. Kennedy greeted a group of persons and then walked to the fenced-off spectator area. I followed the President and Mrs. Kennedy. After 10 to 15 minutes, the President, Mrs. Kennedy, Governor Connally, State of Texas, and Mrs. Connally entered the presidential limousine. The motorcade departed Love Field and proceeded on its scheduled route. During this motorcade, I held a post on the right front door running board of the U.S. Secret Service follow-up car. Several times en route, the President's car stopped, and the President shook hands with the crowd. In the downtown, heavily congested areas of Dallas, a teenage male came forth from the crowd on my right side. I left the follow-up car, chased the youth several yards before running him into the crowds on the right side. We departed the downtown area, and the crowds diminished noticeably. At about 12:30 p.m., we began the approach to the Thornton Freeway, traveling approximately 20 to 25 miles per hour in a slight incline. I was about 25 to 30 feet from President Kennedy, who was located in the right rear seat. I heard what appeared to be firecrackers going off from my position. I immediately turned to my right rear, trying to locate the source, but was not able to determine the exact location. Let me pause right here for a moment. This is clear in the Altgens photo. The world-famous Altgens photo, if you examine it closely, shows that all of the Secret Service agents are already looking back towards the book depository. And if you zoom in on the President through the front windshield, you can clearly see that the President's already been hit and that he's grabbing at his throat. And this does not match what we see on the Zapruder film. The Zapruder film, it appears he's hit much later than that. All right, let me continue. At this time, the U.S. Secret Service follow-up car seemed to slow, and I heard someone from inside this car say, "He's shot." I left the follow-up car in the direction of the President's car, but was recalled by ATSAC Emory Roberts, Secret Service, as the cars increased their speeds. I got back on the car and seated myself besides Mr. Roberts in the right front seat. The cars proceeded to the hospital, several miles distance. Okay, this is where we start to run into problems with the statements of John D. Reedy, because this paragraph here is 100% completely debunked by the photographic record. Let me reread this. At this time, the U.S. Secret Service follow-up car seemed to slow, and I heard someone from inside this car say, "He's shot." I left the follow-up car in the direction of the president's car, but was recalled by 8sec Emory Roberts' Secret Service as the cars increased their speeds. I got back on the car and seated myself beside Mr. Roberts in the right front seat. The cars proceeded to the hospital several miles distance. So, one thing that we can completely derive from his statement here is that he claims that he left the follow-up car to run towards the president's car. However, when we read the statement of Emory Roberts, it's clear that he saw that Reedy was going to. He could tell by his body language and his demeanor that he was about to jump off the car to run, but that at that point, before he actually got off the car, Emory Roberts stopped him and recalled him to the car. Okay? This is clearly in Dealey Plaza, and it is clearly prior to when Clint Hill can be seen in the Zapruder film hopping onto the back of the president's limousine. Okay? Does this all make sense so far? Everybody following? When he says I got back on the car and seated myself beside Mr. Roberts in the right front seat, that's a blatant lie. However, that would have occurred in Dealey Plaza before they got to the triple underpass. Okay? Because he allegedly got off the car and was going to run to the president's limousine, but was recalled back. And this is clearly prior to Clint Hill hopping on the back of the president's limousine, because it's not captured at all. Reedy's activities are not captured at all in the Zapruder film, right? The Secret Service car is not seen at all in the Zapruder film. So it says I got back on the car and seated myself besides Mr. Roberts in the right front seat. Okay, so we know that that's not what happened. We know that he got into the second row of seats, not the front row. He got into the second row of seats. And this becomes evident when we get to McIntyre photo number 2, which we will get to. The thing that's important here, that Reedy himself is claiming, is that he re-entered the Secret Service follow-up car and sat in it. Not on the running board, but sat in it. So he got inside the vehicle sometime in Dealey Plaza prior to arriving at the triple underpass. Okay? Extremely important. On my arrival at the Parkland Hospital, Dallas, hospital personnel were awaiting the arrival of President Kennedy. After the president was taken to the emergency room, I was posted by ASAC Kellerman at the door entrance. I remained on this post until notified by ASAC Roberts that we were leaving for Love Field with President Johnson. I departed the hospital in a Dallas police cruiser to the rear of President Johnson. Upon my arrival at Love Field, I boarded the presidential aircraft, Air Force One, expecting to depart immediately. It was at this time I was notified that Mrs. Kennedy and the late president were returning to Washington, D.C. on this plane. ASAC Roberts asked me to set up the airport security, which I did. Mrs. Kennedy arrived, and we were relieved by the 4 to 12 shift, who then boarded the presidential aircraft. At 3:15 p.m., I departed Love Field, Dallas, Texas for Washington, D.C. on the vice presidential aircraft Air Force Two. Signed, John Reedy, Special Agent, White House Detail, November 22nd, 1963. So, the important stuff to derive from his statement, as I already covered, was the fact that he had entered the Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza, allegedly immediately after being recalled to the vehicle by Emory Roberts, but that's not captured in the Zapruder film, and Emory Roberts' statement somewhat slightly contradicts that and says that he never actually got off of the car, or implies he never actually got off the car, but he was going to. But that's kind of irrelevant. The relevant thing is that according to John D. Jack Reedy, he got back into the Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza before the triple underpass. Okay? which is evident in McIntyre photo number 1 because he is no longer on the Secret Service car in McIntyre photo number 1. All right? There's only one person on the side of the Secret Service car where where John D. Jack Reedy and Paul Landis were. And this person has a flat top, but we'll get to that. All right, let us move into the statements of Paul Landis. This is somewhat lengthy, and we have another shorter statement, and we have some commentary by Weisberg on it. Assassination of President John Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963 at Dallas, Texas. Statement of Special Agent Paul E. Landis, Jr., United States Secret Service, concerning his activities and official duties on November 22nd, 1963. On November 22nd, 1963, I arrived at Love Field Airport, Dallas, Texas at 11:35 a.m., having traveled from Fort Worth, Texas to Dallas, Texas, aboard U.S. Air Force Flight number 6970. Upon my arrival, I disembarked from the aircraft and immediately walked to where the motorcade vehicles were parked. Special Agent Sam Kinney was the first person that I recognized, and I remember speaking to him and standing by the follow-up car and jokingly asked him if he could tell me where the follow-up car was. After speaking to Sam, I walked over to Special Agent Wynn Lawson just to double-check to see if I was still assigned to working the follow-up car as had previously been arranged. He was standing by the front right fender of the car in which the president would be riding, and he told me that I was to still ride in the follow-up car. Only a very few moments later, the president's aircraft would be pulling up to its mooring spot, and I moved up to where I would be near the president and first lady when they disembarked from the aircraft. There appeared to be a very large crowd at the airport, and most of the people were restrained behind a chain-link fence, which was about 4 or 5 feet high. On the opposite side of the fence from the crowd, there was a very narrow sidewalk and curbing which ran along the fence line. There were several people on the same side of the fence as the president, but most of them were photographers. As soon as the president and first lady disembarked from the aircraft, Mrs. Kennedy was presented a bouquet of roses. The president was also presented what appeared to be 2 hand-drawn charcoal portraits of himself and Mrs. Kennedy in a black leather and glass folding frame. I believe that this was given to him by a lady wearing a red coat. Just after the president received the black leather frame, I held out my hand and he handed it to me. I had been standing just off to Mrs. Kennedy's left, slightly in front of her. She was on the left side of the president. At this time, the president and first lady started walking towards the crowd, which was restrained behind the fence. On the way, they did stop for a few seconds to talk to an elderly lady in a wheelchair who was on the field area, about 30 feet from where the above presentations were made. They then walked over to the crowd and walked along the fence from their right to left. At first, I was in front of the president, clearing a pathway through the photographers and observing the crowd reaching over the fence. But I noticed that Mrs. Kennedy was moving along slower and becoming separated from the president, so I asked another agent, I don't recall who, to move up where I was, and I dropped back to assist Special Agent Clinton Hill, who was next to Mrs. Kennedy. I continued to keep a pathway clear for Mrs. Kennedy, removing small hand signs that had been dropped in her pathway, and on the sidewalk and occasionally cautioning to watch out for the curbing. At one point, where the direction of the fence made a right angle turn to the left of the way we were moving, I do remember reaching up and holding a fairly large flag away that someone was waving over the fence. Only a few feet further, and the fence and sidewalk made another 90-degree turn in the direction in which we were originally moving. At this point, we stopped momentarily and started in the direction of the cars, which were slightly behind us and had been moving along toward us. Mrs. Kennedy asked where the president was, and S.A. Hill noticed him continuing along the fence, shaking hands with the crowd. So Mrs. Kennedy returned to the fence and did the same. Only a short distance later, the president and first lady stopped shaking hands and entered their automobile. I stood by the right rear side until the car started moving and then hopped on the right rear portion of the right running board follow-up car. I was standing with my right leg on the running board and my left leg up over the inside of the follow-up car. I stayed in this position until we were leaving the airport area and remarked that, quote, I might as well get all the way in, and so I did. I glanced at my watch but didn't recall the time. Special Agents Glenn Bennett and George Hickey were seated to my left, respectively, in the rear of the follow-up car. Mr. David Powers was seated directly in front of me in the center position of the follow-up car. And Mr. Kenneth O'Donnell was seated on Mr. Powers' left. Special Agent Sam Kinney was driving, and 8-Sack Roberts was seated in the right front seat. Special Agents John Reedy, Clinton Hill, and Tim McIntyre were standing on the right front, and left rear portions of the running board, respectively. The motorcade had not proceeded far when 8-Sack Roberts asked me to get back on the outside running board, just in case, which I immediately did. The crowd was about 2 deep along each side of the road, and I would guess that we were traveling about 20 miles per hour. As the motorcade proceeded towards the main business section of downtown Dallas, I watched the crowd for anyone trying to run towards the president's car or any persons who might be holding anything harmful in his hands. I observed the rooftops and windows of the buildings along the route. On the outskirts of town, most of the buildings were 1 or 2 story type structures, and very few people were on the rooftops. The crowd was 3 or more deep along the street, and we proceeded towards downtown Dallas, with most intersections more heavily crowded. The outskirts seemed to consist mostly of used car lots, junk dealers, auto parts stores, and this typical type of neighborhood. At one intersection, there were some Cuban pickets, but I don't recall exactly what their signs said, except that they did have Cuba on them. A little further towards town, some people had a sign asking the president to please stop and shake hands, which he saw. As he passed and stopped, I immediately ran up to his car as it stopped and assumed a position next to him, and observed the crowd as it merged on the car, especially watching the hands. Most of the people were children, but I do remember one of the adult ladies who was holding a sign remarked, "It worked. Our sign worked." At various places along the route, I remember Mr. Dave Powers standing up and taking movies of the president's car and crowd. The closer we came to downtown Dallas, the larger the crowds became. At several places, they were forcing their way into the street, and there was just barely enough room for the cars to get through. There were 2 motorcycle escorts on each side of the president and the follow-up car, and in several instances, the crowd was so close that the motorcycles could not get through and had to drop completely behind the follow-up car. During these instances, S.A. Clint Hill would run and jump on the left rear bumper of the president's car, and he would ride there until the crowd was further back away from the president's car. Just before we reached the heart of downtown Dallas, I remember noticing some new-looking, very high, multi-storied skyscrapers, and remarked to Jack Reedy that there were even people way up on the roof of one. I think the motorcade made a right turn onto Main Street, as that is the only street sign I saw and remembered. I remember thinking to myself that about every town I know of has a Main Street. I'm not sure how far we traveled on Main Street, but I do know that this is where the crowd seemed the heaviest. The buildings were tall on both sides of the street, but I didn't notice many people in the windows. I continued to scan the crowds on the street and the buildings along the route. I glanced at the president's car somewhere along Main Street and saw Clint Hill again standing on the left rear bumper behind Mrs. Kennedy, who was seated in the president's left. Governor Conley was seated in front of the president, and Mrs. Conley was in front of Mrs. Kennedy. The crowd lined both sides of the street, and in several places was right out into the street, leaving barely enough room to get through. Not long after we turned onto Main Street, there was one boy who I would say was in his early teens who ran out from the crowd after the president and follow-up cars and had passed and tried to overtake the president's car. I saw him coming and tapped S.A. Reedy on the shoulder and pointed towards him. He was carrying a camera. S.A. Reedy jumped off the running board, overtook the boy, and pushed him back into the crowd. When we reached the end of Main Street, we turned right and approached a gradual left turn. As we approached the intersection, and while we were turning, a quick surveillance of a building, which was to be on the president's right. Once the left turn was completed, it appeared to be the last one in sight. It was a modernistic type building, approximately 8 stories high, and it had large glass windows. I also seem to recollect orange paneling or siding. None of the windows were open, and I did not see anyone standing by them. I surmised that the building was closed or that all its employees were out on the street corner. As the president's car continued around the corner, I continued to survey the crowd along the right-hand side of the road and noticed that it was fairly scattered, with hardly enough people to form a single line. I continued to look ahead to an overpass over the route we were traveling. At approximately this point, I would say the president's car and the follow-up car had just completed their turns and were both straightening out. At this moment, I heard what sounded like the report of a high-powered rifle from behind me, over my right shoulder. When I heard the sound, there was no question in my mind what it was. My first glance was at the president, as I was practically looking in his direction anyway. I saw him moving in a manner which I thought was to look in the direction of the sound. I did not realize that President Kennedy had been shot at this point. I immediately returned my gaze over my right shoulder towards the modernistic building I had observed before. With a quick glance, I saw nothing, and immediately started scanning the crowd at the intersection from my right to my left. I observed nothing unusual, and began to think that the sound had been that of a firecracker, but I hadn't seen any smoke. In fact, I recall Special Agent Jack Reedy saying, "What was that, a firecracker?" I remarked, "I don't know, I don't see any smoke." So far, the lapse period of time could not have been over 2 or 3 seconds. All during this time, I continued to scan the crowd, returning my gaze toward the president's car. It must have been another second or two before the next shot was fired, because as I recall, having seen nothing out of the ordinary, I then thought that maybe one of the cars in the motorcade had a blowout that had echoed off the buildings. I looked at the right front tire of the president's car and saw it was all right. I then glanced to see the right rear tire, but could not because the follow-up car was too close. I also thought of trying to run up and jump on the president's car, but did not think I could make it because of the speed at which we were traveling. I decided I'd better stay where I was so that I would be at least near the First Lady to whom I am assigned. I think that it was at this point that I thought faster, thinking that we could not get out of the area soon enough. However, I don't have any ideas as to how fast we were then moving. I had drawn my gun, but I am not exactly sure when I did this. I did leave my suit coat unbuttoned all during the motorcade movement, thinking at the time I could get to my gun faster this way if I had to. I glanced toward the president, and he still appeared to be fairly upright in his seat, leaning slightly towards Mrs. Kennedy with his head tilted slightly back. I think Mrs. Kennedy had her right arm around the president's shoulders at this time. I also remember Special Agent Clint Hill attempting to climb onto the back of the president's car. It was at this moment that I heard a second report, and it appeared that the president's head split open with a muffled exploding sound. I can best describe the sound as I heard it as the sound you would get by shooting a high-powered bullet into a 5-gallon can of water or shooting into a melon. I saw pieces of flesh and blood flying through the air, and the president slumped out of sight towards Mrs. Kennedy. The time lapse between the first and second report must have been about 4 or 5 seconds. My immediate thought was that the president could not possibly be alive after being hit like he was. I still was not certain from which direction the second shot came, but my reaction at this time was that the shot came from somewhere towards the front right-hand side of the road. I did not notice anyone on the overpass, and I scanned the area to the right of and below the overpass where the terrain sloped toward the road on which we were traveling. The only person I recall seeing clearly was a Negro male in light green slacks and a beige-colored shirt running from my left to right, up the slope across a grassy section, along a sidewalk towards some steps and what appeared to be a low stone wall. He was bent over while running, and I started to point towards him, but I didn't notice anything in his hands, and by that time we were going under the overpass at a very high rate of speed. I was looking back and saw a motorcycle policeman stopping along the curb approximately adjacent to where I saw the Negro running. After we rode under the overpass, I again looked at the president's car and saw Special Agent Clint Hill lying across the trunk. He was looking back towards the follow-up car, shaking his head back and forth, and gave a thumbs down with his hand. 8-Sec Roberts asked if anyone got the exact time of the shooting, and someone said about 12:30 p.m. Then someone told me to get inside the car and pulled me by the arm. My sunglasses fell off, and Special Agent Bennett handed them to me. By now, we were on an expressway and had a few people were standing in spots along the way, waving as we went by. All right, let me pause right here, because this is where the problem lies. Okay. We have John D. Reedy, who was clearly not on the Secret Service car by the time it gets to the triple underpass. He has already entered the Secret Service follow-up car, but he lies. He did not get in the front seats, because that's debunked by McIntyre photo number 2. And if he didn't get in the front seats, where did he go? He had to have gotten in either the second or third row of seats. I will tell you that he got into the second row of seats. And how do I know this? I know this because Dave Powers exited the second row of seats, leaving only one person. One person. And that's Kenneth O'Donnell. He left Kenneth O'Donnell sitting there. So Dave Powers gets out of the car. Kenneth O'Donnell is sitting in the second row. But by the time we get to McIntyre photo number 2, we have 3 people seated in that second row. Okay, 3. So who could possibly be the other 2 people? The other 2 people are clearly John D. Reedy and, as we shall see when we get to the photographs, Paul Landis. Because Paul Landis, when did Paul Landis actually do this? Paul Landis actually entered the Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza at the exact same time John D. Reedy did. Because it is clearly not Paul Landis on the side of the Secret Service car as the vehicle passes the triple underpass, because that person, and is clearly obvious in McIntyre's photo number 1 and number 2, that the person on the side of the Secret Service car has a flat top. And by the time we get to to the McIntyre photo number 2 on the Secret Service car, we'll see that that person also has a mustache. Okay? It is clearly not Paul Landis. And there's absolutely no reason for there to have been, for John D. Reedy to have gotten back on the outside of the Secret Service car when you look at McIntyre photo number 2. Because he entered in Dealey Plaza, and at no time does he ever say he got back on the side of the Secret Service car. Because he didn't. Because by the time you get to McIntyre photo number 2, the Secret Service car goes from having 8 passengers to having 10 passengers. Okay? That's why this statement here from Paul Landis is so crucial, because he lies about when he gets into the Secret Service car. He lies about remaining on the Secret Service car as it passes the triple underpass. And he lies about when he gets in the Secret Service car. That's why this is all relevant. Let me go ahead and wrap up this statement, and then we'll get on to the photographs. ASIC Roberts was telling the other agents in the follow-up car to cover Vice President Johnson as soon as we stopped. Sometime around 12:37 p.m., we arrived at Parkland Memorial Hospital. I immediately ran to the left rear side of the president's car, reached over and tried to help Mrs. Kennedy up by taking hold of her shoulders. She did not want to let go of President Kennedy, whose head she held in her lap, and she was bending him over. She said something like, "No, I want to stay with him." Agent Hill had in the meantime opened the left rear door of the presidential convertible, stepped inside, and took Mrs. Kennedy by the arm. She released the president, and someone said, "Cover up his head." Agent Hill took off his suit coat and covered up the president's head. I also remember Mr. Powers leaning in the car and saying, "Oh no, Mr. President, Mr. President." Okay, so Dave Powers gets out in Dealey Plaza, right? But he caught a ride there, I believe, with the news guys, if I'm not mistaken. So, but anyway, Dave Powers catches a ride to the hospital in another car because he exited in Dealey Plaza, right? So that has to be considered and taken into consideration when you revisit how many people were on the car as it exited the Stemmons Freeway, right? By this time, someone was lifting the president's body out of the right side of the car. Agent Hill helped Mrs. Kennedy out of the car, and I followed. Mrs. Kennedy's purse and hat and a cigarette lighter were on the back seat. I picked these 3 items up as I walked through the car and followed Mrs. Kennedy into the hospital. The president's body was taken directly to an emergency room, and I think I remember Mrs. Kennedy following the people in, but coming out almost immediately. The door to the emergency room was closed, and I stayed by Mrs. Kennedy's side. Someone in the meantime had brought a chair for Mrs. Kennedy to sit in, and she sat just outside of the emergency room. There were several people milling around, and with the help of a nurse, we cleared all unauthorized personnel out of the immediate area. Someone came out of the room that the president was in and asked if anyone knew his blood type. ASAC Kellerman and S.A. Hill immediately reached for their wallets. ASAC Kellerman gave the man the information first. At one point, someone else came out of the president's room again and said he was still breathing. Mrs. Kennedy stood up and said, "Do you mean he may live?" No one answered. Most of the time while in the hospital, I stayed right next to Mrs. Kennedy. Twice, I believe, she went to the room where the president was. However, I remained outside by the door. A short time later, I still remember several people standing around, and I asked the doctor for help in clearing the area. At approximately 2 p.m., the president's body was wheeled from the hospital in a coffin into an ambulance. Special Agent Andrew Berger drove the ambulance. ASIC Kellerman and ASIC Stout were in the front seat. Mrs. Kennedy, Admiral Berkeley, and Agent Hill rode in the rear of the ambulance with the president's body. I rode in the follow-up car behind the ambulance, which departed the hospital at 2:04 p.m. At 2:14 p.m., the president's body arrived at Love Field, and several Secret Service agents immediately carried it on board U.S. Air Force Number 1 via the rear door. I followed on board behind Mrs. Kennedy and then moved to the forward section of the plane. I witnessed the swearing-in of President Johnson at 2:39 p.m. in the center compartment on board Air Force One at 2:47 p.m. Departed Love Field, Dallas, Texas, via Air Force One with Mrs. Kennedy and the body of the late President Kennedy. Upon our arrival at Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland, at 5:58 p.m., I helped carry the late President Kennedy's coffin from Air Force One. The body was placed in an ambulance, which departed Andrews Air Force Base approximately 6:10 p.m., driven by Special Agent William Greer. Asa Kellerman, Admiral Berkeley, and I rode in the front seat of the ambulance. Mrs. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy rode in the rear of the ambulance with President Kennedy's body. The above party arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland, at approximately 6:55 p.m. Special Agent Hill and I escorted Mrs. Kennedy to the 17th floor, where we immediately secured the area. Only hospital personnel assigned to the area, Kennedy family members and friends, and authorized personnel were allowed in the area. I only left the 17th floor twice while Mrs. Kennedy was there, once to find Asa Kellerman in the hospital morgue and give him a telephone message from Chief Rowley. The other time was to find a White House driver. At 3:56 a.m. on November 23rd, 63, Mrs. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy departed Bethesda Naval Hospital via ambulance, accompanying the late President John F. Kennedy's body to the White House. Special Agent William Greer was driving, and Asa Kellerman accompanied. Special Agent Clint Hill rode in the first limousine behind the ambulance, and I rode in the second limousine. The above party arrived at the White House at 4:24 a.m. And that concludes the statement of Paul Landis. Okay, so now we have a second statement of Paul Landis. Or is this the Weisberg analysis? Let me see. Yeah, okay, so I think this is jumping right to some of Weisberg's analysis. Heading of statement of Paul Landis, 11/30/63, 7 pp. Landis is the, I can't read what this says, the one something boy of the agent, one with memory for detail. His statements begin... Landis is the chit-chat boy of the agents. There we go. The chit-chat boy of the agents, one with a memory for detail. His statement begins with a detailed recall of irrelevant, like the color of the coat, the lady who gave Mrs. JFK the roses, the angle of the fence at the airport, in the direction in which they turned, etc. On page 3, another triviality should be noted on the chance it hold future interest. Dave Powers took movies from inside the car. It might be interesting to know how close to Dealey Plaza he took them. It took 3 full pages of nothingness to get to Dealey Plaza. However, he does say that he did take in the Texas School Book Depository and that he saw no one standing in any of the windows. But because he has been giving all this unessential detail, I think that he gives on to the timing and location of the first shot may be worthwhile. He says both cars had made the turn and were not yet straightened out when I heard what sounded like the report of high-powered rifle from behind me over my right shoulder. Now, first of all, the M-C is not, quote, high-powered. And second of all, at that point, over Landis's right shoulder to the east of the Texas School Book Depository, he again took in the Texas School Book Depository and saw nothing. Interestingly, and confirming his account, is this recollection that in checking to see if there had been a blowout in front of him, he could see the right front tire of the president's car. This confirms that the cars had not yet straightened out and that the follow-up car had to have been further to the right than in line with the president's car, and only reason he couldn't see the right rear tires because the follow-up was too close. He calls the third shot and the second he heard and described it like the sound of a high-powered bullet going into a give-gallon can of water, a can when it impacted. He saw flying flesh and blood. He felt the shot came from the right front. He scanned the overpass to the right, and he saw a well-described Negro running up the knoll before he got under the overpass. Hill gave the thumbs down signal, which is ample identification of what he saw. For some reason, Hill found this intelligence unworthy of mentioning in his own story. Powers also saw the head wound. Someone told Hill to cover the wounds, but no account of the dispute over moving the body. It is within reason that not one of the agents spontaneously considered this rather spectacular event worthy of note. Of these statements in the Berkeley files, this establishes Landis as the man with the eye for detail and with recall plus lucidity and a willingness to take time to record things. It seems highly improbable that he on his own omitted this very unpleasant bit. Thus the question of the integrity of the statement is raised, and when it is further considered that they were prepared beginning a week after the tragedy, further suspicion can be cast upon the... it says there's a comma and then a dot, and then it moves on to the next paragraph. He left the 17th floor but once to give Kellerman a message from Rowley. And he also makes no mention of Berkeley's departure from the hospital, nor does any one of the agents saw who handled the casket at Bethesda, another seemingly strange omission, and the only effect of which could be to make it more difficult to find those who could give first-hand testimony, certainly making it less likely there would be interest in them for such a purpose. Interesting commentary, huh? All right, here we have some additional commentary from Weisberg on the statement of Paul E. Landis. See, I don't know if he had the photographic record at the time, and if he did, how come he didn't find any of this stuff, right? Statements of Witnesses, Secret Service Agent Paul Landis, Jr., Volume 18, page 751 to 57, undated. Not until the fourth page does he get to the assassination scene. Here he describes a brief surveillance of the depository building of which he said none of the windows were open. He places the time of the first bullet at when, quote, the president's car and the follow-up car had just completed their turns and both were straightening out. Note that this is in advance of the time decision of the commission, but in conformity with my reconstruction. He described the report as that of a high-powered rifle from behind me, and there was no question in my mind what it was. He said that the second shot came in a second or two, and that, quote, I looked at the right front tire of the president's car and saw it was all right. This shows that the follow-up car was then to the right of the president's car, or that the president's car was turned to its right. He decided against running to the president's car because of the speed at which we were traveling, and he saw the president's head split open with a muffled explosive sound. I can best describe the sound as I heard it, as the sound you would get by shooting a high-powered bullet into a 5-gallon can of water or shooting into a melon. I saw pieces of flesh and blood flying through the air, and the president slumped out of sight towards Mrs. Kennedy, end quote. He then says, while uncertain of the source, quote, my reaction at this time was that the shot came from somewhere towards the front right-hand side of the road, end quote. He also said, quote, I did not notice anyone on the overpass, which apparently is in considerable error. He saw a Negro in light green slacks and a beige-colored shirt running from his left to right up the slopes of the grassy section, along the sidewalk towards some steps in what appeared to be a low stone wall. This again indicates shots were well in advance of the point at which the commission located them. See my reconstruction under photographs. He says that he got Mrs. Kennedy's purse, hat, lighter from the back seat, but makes no reference to any other objects there. He also places the time of arrival of the body at Bethesda at 6:55. On page 758, 759, Landis has a supplementary statement dated November 27th. It is largely repetitious, including the closed windows, the identification of the high-powered rifle, and his view of the right front tire of the presidential car. In talking about the first shot and the overpass, he gives a slightly different version, which makes more sense. Quote, my reaction at this time was that the shot came from somewhere towards the front, but I did not see anyone on the overpass and looked along the right-hand side of the road, end quote. Continued statement of Secret Service Agent Landis commentary, quote, my reaction at this time was that the shot came from somewhere towards the front, but I did not see anyone on the overpass and looked towards the right-hand side of the road, end quote. I take this to mean that he saw no one on the overpass who might have fired a shot. So there's just some interpretation there by Weisberg that I don't know that I agree with. He's kind of justifying the statements of Paul Landis here, but so let us move on to the photographic record. And if you've been listening to the podcast, this is about the time at which you're going to want to hop over to look at these photographs. And so This photograph here that we're looking at is Altgen's photo. I believe it's Altgen's photo number 7. Okay. And it's pretty cut and dry. There's a couple things we need to notice here, and that's that there are 10 men on the Secret Service car. Okay. I know if you're looking at the video, my little TV here is cutting out the listed names, but here we go. You can scroll up to see them right there. Clint Hill, Bill McIntyre is number 2. John D. Reedy is number 3. Paul Landis is number 4. Kenny O'Donnell is number 5. Dave Powers number 6. George Hickey's number 7. Glenn Bennett's number 8. And then out of sight are Samuel Kinney and Emery Roberts, because they're in the front seat. They're driving the car. Okay. I need you to notice something. Look at 3 and 4. Number 3 is John D. Jack Reedy. Okay. He doesn't have a flat top at all. Okay. He's going bald in back, and he's got the receding hairline in front. And we'll see a better picture of him coming up. And then number 4, that's Paul Landis right there. And look at his. He doesn't have a flat top either. He's got a very rounded haircut. Okay. Very rounded haircut. Both of these guys' hairstyles are rounded. Okay. Neither one of them has a flat top. And there are 10 men on this car. Okay. So then when you realize that 2 people got off the car, Dave Powers, who was seated behind Emery Roberts in the middle section, the second row of seats, and Clint Hill gets off the car. He was on the front driver's side running board. He goes and runs and gets on the back of the president's limousine. That's not disputed. None of what I've said so far is disputed. Period. 10 men pulled into Dealey Plaza on the Secret Service follow-up car. 2 men got off, Dave Powers and Clint Hill, leaving 8 men on the car. This is undisputed. This here is a picture of Clint Hill on the back of the president's limousine. You can see that the lead car, which contains Decker and Forrest Sorrells and Win Lawson, they are pulling off to the left-hand side. You can already see it happening, right? The brake lights are on. They know something's happening. I've seen people say that they make allegations of masking in this photo. I'm not exactly sure what that means, except for covering up what's in that front lead car. There have been those allegations made. I don't know if there's any validity to them. But what we can definitely tell is that there is the brake lights are on in the lead car, and that it is moved over in order to allow the president's limousine to shoot by it. And it will do so with Clint Hill on the back of the car. Let me read this. This says, these are notes from the motorcade, the official paperwork on the motorcade. Follow-up car has mounted SS radio tuned to Charlie frequency. All SS agents armed with 38 revolvers. Hickey has AR-15 Colt 223 automatic rifle. S.A. Hill moves back and forth from the SS car to the limousine, finally staying there following the shooting until arrival at Parkland. And remember, every single witness in the Secret Service car stated that he laid on the trunk and stayed on the trunk. He never got into the actual car. He stayed on the trunk. S.A. Bennett moves to the limousine on Main Street and returns to the follow-up car. That must have happened before they made the turn on to Houston. During the shooting, S.A. Reedy runs toward the limousine, but is called back by ASIC Roberts. We've discussed that ad nauseum. Didn't actually happen, but he was going to do it. And it is at that point that he says that he hops into the Secret Service car and got into the front seat. But we know he lied because of a photograph coming up that will be able to prove that he lied. So this is McIntyre photo number 1. Okay, McIntyre photo number 1. Here you can see that the lead car has moved over, and it is allowing the limousine to shoot by. And behind the limousine is the Secret Service car. Now, when you zoom in on McIntyre photo number 1, there's a lot going on here. the first thing I want to address is there are two number ones, okay? The number one on the left is the person who is now on the side of the Secret Service car. Remember, it's not John D. Reedy, because John D. Reedy has already acknowledged that he entered the Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza before they reached the underpass. Okay? Paul Landis claims that he's on the side of the Secret Service car as they pass through the underpass. But could this be Paul Landis? No. Clearly, this person has a flat top, which is obvious in this photograph here. The other number one is Glenn Bennett, who's in the back seat with the AR-15. Okay. Now, let's move to the next person over. So the only person left on the driver's side running board of the Secret Service follow-up car is Bill McIntyre, right? But he's being blocked by this person who's in front of him, okay? So we have now what appears to be a person standing up, wearing a black jacket and a black hat. And it appears as though they're standing in the back of the president's limousine. Behind this person, they are obstructing the view of Bill McIntyre, who's standing on the side of the Secret Service car. Now, we know that this person is in front of the Secret Service car, and that that's not Bill McIntyre, because they are clearly obstructing the windshield of the Secret Service follow-up car. They're clearly in front of the Secret Service follow-up car. And the image of the person number one on the left with the flat top who's standing on the side of the Secret Service follow-up car, they are noticeably elevated in the photograph upwards about a half an inch from this person who appears to be standing in the back of the president's limousine. And this person who appears to be standing in the back of the president's limousine, which we can say is definitely in front of the Secret Service follow-up car because of the obstruction of the windshield. It appears as though they're holding something long at a 45-degree angle. Right here. If you can follow my mouse, you can see they're holding something at this angle right here. And that thing that they're holding is obstructing the view of the Secret Service follow-up car. So you have the person's hat, their jacket, their arm coming down here, the elbow extending this way. This is the 45-degree angle. That looks like a man holding a rifle to me. If someone else has another explanation, I've asked 100 people to look at this, and I've gotten the same reaction every time. Every single person I've ever shown this to has agreed with me that this appears to be a man standing in the back of the president's limousine, holding what appears to be a rifle, and this is clearly in front of the Secret Service follow-up car because it's clearly obstructing the view of the windshield of the follow-up car. Okay? To the right of the president's limousine, it appears as though you have Clint Hill's head hanging over the side of the limousine from the trunk of the car. Okay? That's the way he laid on the car, and this is his head hanging over the side of the limousine as he stayed on the trunk. He never stood in the back of the car, in the back of the limousine. Okay? So what does this imply? This implies that somebody was picked up by Greer in the president's limousine, and they got into the back seat where they're photographed here in the McIntyre photo number one, clearly holding a rifle. Clearly holding a rifle. Okay? And although Paul Landis claims to be the person on the side of the Secret Service follow-up car, Paul Landis does not have a flat top. Paul Landis has a very rounded haircut. Let's zoom out just a little bit, and we can see this game of leapfrog that is occurring. And you can see the image of the person standing in the back seat of the president's limousine much clearer here. You can clearly see the differentiation in the fact that they are in front of the president's limousine, and that what they are holding in their hands is obstructing the windshield, right? But they're at the same general height as Glenn Bennett and the person standing on the side of the Secret Service car, who clearly could not be Paul Landis. And it's not Jack Reedy, because Jack Reedy already jumped into the Secret Service car, as he said in his statement in Dealey Plaza. Okay? So, therefore, what do we have here? We have someone standing in the backseat of the president's limousine holding a rifle, while the two Secret Service agents, Paul Landis and John D. Jack Reedy, have already entered the Secret Service follow-up car. And clearly, in the middle of Dealey Plaza, when those two agents entered the Secret Service follow-up car, they had to have clearly picked up this other individual who has a flat top. Clearly visible in this photograph here, has a flat top on the side of the Secret Service follow-up car. I hope everybody can see what I'm saying. I hope you can pick up what I'm putting down. Everybody here is complicit in this, is what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the person that they picked up on the other side of the knoll is clearly the person who was the knoll shooter, because they're holding this rifle here, as is obvious in McIntyre photo number 1. Now, the first thing I need to point out when we look at McIntyre photo number 2 is that now there's two people on the side of the Secret Service car, whereas in the previous photograph, there was only one. You have the guy with the flat top. In McIntyre photo number 1, he's the only person standing on the side of the Secret Service follow-up car. But by the time you get to McIntyre photo number 2, you now have two people on the side of the Secret Service follow-up car. All right. Next thing I want to point out, I'm going to scroll back a couple photographs here because you need to notice this. Look at Paul Landis and look at John Reedy on the side of the Secret Service car. They both have rounded hairstyles and they are both the same height. They are both about 6 foot tall. Okay. Look at the difference between their height and the height of the windshield. Okay. These guys are 6 foot tall and they're about the same height. Okay. Yet, however, when we scroll here to McIntyre photo number 2, it becomes brutally obvious that that is not John D. Jack Reedy and Paul Landis. Okay. We have the man with the flat top on the right-hand side who clearly has a mustache also. Okay. Wearing sunglasses. And remember, seeing as how in McIntyre photo number 1, you only have one person on the side of the Secret Service car. That's because John D. Jack Reedy had already entered the Secret Service car and entered not the front row of seats like he claims, but the second row of seats. And how do we know he entered the second row of seats? Because when you look here at McIntyre photo number 2, which is well beyond the underpass, which is well on its way to the Stemmons Freeway, you only have two people in the front seat. Only two people in the front seat. Which means that John D. Reedy lied and that he hopped into the second row of seats because here you clearly have 3 people in the second row of seats. Once again, this is John D. Reedy and this is Paul Landis. And you can see, look how tall they are. They're both about 6 foot tall and they both have rounded haircuts, okay? Neither one of them has a flat top or anything that can be interpreted as a flat top. Right? And especially since John D. Reedy claims he was on the front side, the front passenger side of the running board. At no time does he claim to have been on the rear side of the running board, right? So the second person is clearly not John D. Jack Reedy. It's clearly not Paul Landis because look at Paul Landis' rounded haircut here. Once again in Dealey Plaza. Neither one of these guys has a flat top. Paul Landis has the rounded haircut. And they're both on the side of the Secret Service car. And look how tall they are. Then when we get back to the Secret Service car, we can see that these guys, neither one of these guys is 6 foot tall. Okay. And these guys this is David Morales and Jack Valente. Okay. Now there's definitely 10 people in this car. And the people they picked up were Jack Valente and David Morales. The first time I saw this, I'd been studying Jack Valente for well over 2 years at this point. And as soon as I saw this picture, it hit me like a ton of bricks that was Jack Valente. Clearly Jack Valente. And there are 10 men in this car. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's his head. 7. There's his shoulder. 8 sitting in the back seat, 9, and 10. There you go. 10 men. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 men on the Secret Service car, and how many are there supposed to be? 8. And we can say with certainty that this guy right here is not Paul Landis. It's not John D. Jack Reedy. Here, I have some other photographs that I prepared that I want to show really quickly to emphasize this fucking point. Okay, that's David fucking Morales. This photograph here that you're seeing now, that's Paul Landis with his rounded haircut. Does that look anything like the guy on the side of the car with the flat top and the mustache? Absolutely not. It's not Paul Landis. It is not Paul Landis. Next photo. That is clearly not John D. Jack Reedy. Okay? Clearly not John D. Jack Reedy. The first time I saw that, it hit me that was obviously a photograph of Valenti. That is not John D. Jack Reedy, because remember, John D. Jack Reedy said in his statement that he entered the Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza. He is not on the side of the Secret Service car as they pass the triple underpass. The man with the flat top is, who is David Morales. Okay? Then they picked up the person who was standing in the back of the president's limousine as they did the leapfrog. At which time Valenti was given ample opportunity to leave the president's limousine. Run across to the other side of the Secret Service car. Where here you can clearly see that there's two men on the side of the Secret Service car when previously there had only been one. There you go. And that is how the Grassy Knoll shooter came over the top of the underpass, was picked up by William Greer at the other side of the overpass. The game of leapfrog proceeded, at which time Valenti exits the president's limousine, runs to the other side of the Secret Service car, hops on, and is photographed in the McIntyre number 2 photo, where there are clearly 10 men here. Clearly 10 men. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay? So to anyone out there who disbelieves that Jack Valenti was the shooter on the knoll and that the Secret Service car was completely 110% complicit in this, you examine this photograph and explain to me how the Secret Service car went from having 8 men to 10 men. Everything I went over here today is irrefutable. And I challenge anyone out there to debunk this information and contact me. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that, please get a hold of me. This right here is the linchpin of the assassination. This is how the Grassy Knoll shooter pulled off the assassination and then was escorted to Parkland Hospital, where he, Jack Valenti, planted the magic bullet, which was initially a .303. It was then found by O.P. Wright and Daryl Tomlinson, who O.P. Wright made clear to Josiah Thompson it was a pointed tip .303 round. It's handed over to Richard Johnson of the Secret Service. Then he hands it over to James Rowley, who's the head of the Secret Service. He then hands it over to the FBI. The FBI then does their swaparoo and replaces it with the magic bullet, the Carcana round, several years later, right? So clearly Valenti was the one who planted the magic bullet because he was on the side of the Secret Service car. He had access to the ammunition. And what does this mean? It means that he shot the president with an Enfield .303. With pointed tip rounds. And that rifle, I promise you, ended up in the possession of Buell Frazier, who they arrested that day, confiscated an Enfield .303 and pointed tip .303 ammo, just like the original magic bullet. Is all this coincidence? Not at all. This is exactly what happened. This is how they killed our president. And this is how the Secret Service was completely involved in the planning, setup, execution, and cover-up of the assassination of our president. And that's going to do it for me today, guys. Please reach out to me if you have a problem with any of this. Okay? I will be back tomorrow where we're going to pick up with some of these interviews of Lauren Hall. So thanks, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow.